We are picking up now where we left off with an amazing panel of fabulous rockstar experts in AI, risk and opportunity. Turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. It's terrific to see you all here. I'm Michaela McMurra. I am a lawyer at Covington and Burling, and I'm in the cybersecurity and data privacy practice group, but I'm also one of our co-chairs in the technology group with a focus on artificial intelligence and Internet of Things. And I have the tremendous honor of moderating this panel today, where I am as excited as you must be to hear from all of these wonderful women that we have up here who are leaders in cyber and AI. But first, I am delighted to report that this panel has been approved for 1.5 New York State CLE credits in the category of cybersecurity. So terrific news for everybody. The credit is both transitional and non-transitional. It is suitable for both experienced and newly admitted attorneys. For those of you in person, please remember to sign both in and out at the check-in outside to get your CLE credit. And for those of you joining virtually, thank you. I will be announcing the CLE code later in the program. So with that, let's get started. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity challenges, opportunities, and best practices in leveraging artificial intelligence. And to set the foundation for this discussion, we're going to have some discussion about cybersecurity specific risks and opportunities, and also what I will call cyber adjacent issues that we're going to talk about dealing with regulation and some other topics. But we're going to start with use cases because we just heard on our last panel, and Lenny, it was terrific to hear you say this because if you heard her, she was talking about use cases and managing risk in connection with particular use cases. So when you talk about AI now, it's not just one giant umbrella of risk. You actually have to look at, where are we using AI? How are we using AI? How was that AI developed? Was that developed in a way that we think is, acceptable from a risk perspective for that use case? So that's where we're going to start. We also don't want this to be a doomsday panel. So we're going to talk about some of the opportunities as well and some of the wonderful things that we are seeing with AI. So to start on the use cases, we see clients who are using these models and these algorithms in multiple ways. Sometimes it's part of their core business, right? So if you're a life sciences company, you're a pharma company, maybe you are using AI models in drug development, right? So it's part of your core business, your customer-facing business. But then you have these whole other sections of the business where you're using AI tools in connection with HR issues, payroll, compliance issues, just general corporate knowledge management. And so when you're talking about AI, you really need to be thinking about the use case. Am I using this as part of my core customer-facing business, or am I using this part of my corporate function to improve and enhance processes? And what does that mean? So we're going to start there. And Jen, I'm going to start with you. And I've asked everyone to introduce themselves as we go into the discussion here, so you can hear from each panelist. But how are you seeing AI models being used in your work?
All right, thank you. And just to introduce myself very quickly, my name is Jennifer Cady. I'm from Chicago. I work with IBM on our cybersecurity for all of America, so everyone from Canada to Argentina. I've been with IBM for a couple decades, candidly, and I've worked in both data as well as in cyber. My conversation today is going to be heavily bent on the cyber aspects, not necessarily the ethics, but the cyber aspects of AI. And I do want to say very quickly, some of us were talking earlier, when I started and when I was sitting in these chairs, there were not this many women. And so I am incredibly proud and pleased to see each and every one of you here. Lenny, thank you. Your talk about what we can do and how we can better expand ourselves, how we can challenge ourselves to be a cyber, not only an executive presence, but just a learner and someone who's going to be continuously learning. That's the critical part of this business, and especially when we're talking about the use cases. So again, Lenny, your talk was fantastic. Again, thank you. When we're looking at use cases, this isn't, so Gen AI, ChatGPT, the large language models, it's a new conversation, right? We're seeing this over the past year, but this isn't, machine learning and AI isn't necessarily new. We've been working with oncology and developing, when we're looking at life science, we've been developing drugs. We've been using these models for a long period of time. It's how we're using them and what's the proliferation of some of these models now, and what's the accessibility to these models. So there's a risk reward, especially in cyber, when we're talking about the type of models that are being developed and when we're using them. So if I'm using an open source model and I'm in software development, there's a trade-off of, time. Maybe it was crowdsourced. Maybe this was developed amongst a number of different individuals. Maybe this is coming from a number of different data sources, but it's open. I'm going to use this. Now, we'll talk throughout this discussion today about what are some of the parameters around that. As Lenny was talking about, there's a risk that comes with this. So as we're developing these models, it is prolific. I don't think that there's a single business that I've spoken to where it is not a daily discussion, if not regular discussion. And it's well understood that there are ways that we're going to be able to augment and better and become more capable, not only human beings, but frankly, technologists and consumers and people amongst the world by leveraging what we have in these AI models. But again, there's a risk reward that needs to be considered. It doesn't make a difference in terms of which business that I'm speaking to. Every single industry has this is a discussion topic amongst every single industry. We've seen this certainly in the financial institutions and life science over the years, but now I'm seeing it anywhere. Software development, I'm seeing it in HR, our entire HR, as a matter of fact, within IBM, it is almost entirely leveraging Gen AI and natural language in terms of me being able to work with the questions, getting the right answers, but also it's augmented. There are emergency situations where we would need to be able to leverage human as well as machine. And those are the types of cases that, why are you using this? How are you developing it? And then we'll talk a little bit longer about the governance and what does the governance mean in terms of the lineage with respect to those models. But it's prolific. The models are, it doesn't matter which industry that I'm speaking to, and it's in every single conversation. Every manager is being asked, how can I do cost takeout? Leveraging some level of learning. And for us at least, it is an important factor as far as, back to Lenny's conversation, the data and what we're doing with respect to that data and how we're handling that data becomes a very critical conversation in cyber.
Yeah, and you raised a great point too, which is that this conversation feels somewhat new. I mean, now it's about at least a year old since it exploded on the scene. But there are industries, life sciences, financial services, that have been using models for a long time.
Very long.
Fraud detection, et cetera. All of those calls you get from your credit card companies and the pop-ups, was this you, right? There are models driving a lot of that. So it's not new, it's just new maybe in the public consciousness. And of course that was with the large language models and the generative AI.
Well, if my mom's asking about ChatGPT, then definitely it's amongst the population.
Manisha, you
Yeah, so I wanted to pick up on some of the themes that have been talked about. So I think I completely agree with Jennifer that a lot of this is not new, and Michaela made the same point. I think, and just so actually I should introduce myself. My name is Manisha Mithal. I'm a partner at the law firm of Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich & Rosati. I've been there about 2 years, and prior to that, I spent over a decade leading the Federal Trade Commission's Division of Privacy and Identity Protection, where I worked on privacy and cybersecurity issues. And so I'm just gonna put my old regulatory hat on for a second and talk a little bit about use cases from the perspective of the government. So I think that there was an awareness when I was at the FTC that these technologies had been around. AI is used for fraud detection, for credit scoring, and for things like how to build a better widget, right? And so the build a better widget use case wasn't so much on the radar, but some of the others were. And I think there started to be more of a concern, I would say around the time I left, maybe 2-3 years ago, about use of AI for consumer decision-making. Credit, employment, insurance, housing, healthcare. And I think that's really what drove the conversation from the regulator's perspective, when we talk about 2000, 2001. And so I think when you look at even the EU AI Act, when you look at some of the US legislation on AI, it was about, well, how do we make sure that consumers understand there's a right to explainability and there's transparency and data subject rights. But then, generative AI hit the scene. You have these LLMs, and I think regulators were like, oh my gosh, we've been thinking about this in a completely different way. So it's not the kind of banks and consumer-facing organizations that have the monopoly on use of AI. It's these foundational models that are being used in a host of applications. And how do we regulate these foundational models? And so I think the questions have changed, and I'm sure we're going to get into that during this discussion. But I do think that kind of going from how to build a better widget, consumer decision-making, and now Gen AI is the kind of way that regulators are thinking about this.
Joanne, can you introduce yourself and tell us how you're thinking about these issues?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in here. So, hi everyone. My name is Joanne Stonier. I'm currently a senior fellow with MasterCard. focusing on data and AI. Prior to that, I was their chief data officer, and before that, their chief privacy officer. And I've been hanging out doing data for a really long time. Harriet and I go back when privacy and cyber, trust me, there was not this many women. So we are happy to see all of you. And there were many, many times when all of this was evolving. And so I echo Linny's wise words of always learning something new and take on the things that others don't know yet, because you're going to have a fabulous journey. But AI, I will echo my colleagues here, Jen and Manisha, that AI has been around for a while. But you need to think of it as the journey from data analytics to machine learning and artificial intelligence to generative AI. And yes, I've been at a firm where we've been doing, as Manisha knows, we've been using artificial intelligence for quite some time. And a use case for us has always been fraud detection and cybersecurity, right? We operate a network. Let me be clear, a lot of you have a MasterCard in your wallet. I actually watched a movie the other night where they referred to us as Master Charge, which was like,
Oh, that's cool.
whoa. But a MasterCard in your wallet where we sit in between the banks, right? So we sit in between your bank, what we call an issuer's bank, a consumer's bank, and a merchant's bank. And we actually process those payments worldwide. And what we offer is safety and security of those payments, and also fraud detection for all of you so that we make payments safe, simple, and secure. And so a lot of our focus, right, as a business is to make sure payments around the globe in over 200 jurisdictions actually are safe, simple, and secure. And that means we have to use data and analytics, machine learning, AI, and increasingly now generative AI to make sure that we are monitoring the system for all the issues of malfeasance, and I'll use that word very broadly, that are occurring as other entities, other enterprises, other individuals are trying to get at that data. You all know that as fraud on your card, right? And you can be happy when we catch it, when it's right, and you can be annoyed when we catch it when it's wrong, okay, right? When you get a message and you're like, damn it, that is me. Let me make that charge. And generally, we get better and better at the methodologies we use to actually monitor for that, right? And to also release those payments and let you transact when it is indeed you. But what's happening now is that generative AI is taking things to the next level. And so some of the use cases that we're seeing is much like other firms. And we break it down into kind of 3 tranches of use cases. So many organizations are using generative AI, which is different. Manisha is right. In that foundation model companies have created these incredible generative thinking models from publicly available data, right? And we know those models as ChatGPT, DALL-E, Hugging Face, etc., where they have used vast amounts of publicly available information and they have tried to curate it. And the challenge is that the rest of us who are now using or consuming those models have very little transparency into how that's being done. And that's where regulators are getting concerned, to Manisha's point. The rest of us are layering our data, right, our transaction data, for example, on top of that. And what that means is we need to understand how that other information was curated and how our information can be leveraging that fantastic insights. Now, the challenge is we're in early days, right? And this is why boards are interested. This is why regulators are interested. It's why, in fact, you're interested in those outcomes, because you know it, I know it. If we change a prompt, if we ask the prompt today versus yesterday or 3 weeks from now, we get different answers because the data is changing, the intelligence is changing, the globe is changing. And so understanding the data, what we're asking, and the models become increasingly important, but it also means we as human beings, as data and cyber professionals, we'll talk about the cyber risks, it becomes very important that we understand this tool. It is different than search, okay? It has its root in search, but it is not in fact the same thing. And what it does, it actually connects data differently than it's ever been connected before. So even for a company like mine, where we've connected data around the globe forever since our inception, it's more data connected in ways for use that have never been contemplated before, that have never been curated before, for lots of different use. And while we can rely on the machines for a certain amount, we have to rely on all of us to really interrogate those results in a very different way. So I'm going to stop there and let somebody else chat.
I could not have had a better introduction to what Lucy's going to talk about. So, Lucy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think, so I'm Lucy Vosterman. I am at Google, and I'm at a part of Google called Jigsaw. I lead product and engineering for that team. Jigsaw is essentially a small think tank within Google focused on protecting open society. So we're thinking about democratic values or authoritarian governments and how they're each using technology or how technology can be embedded with the values, hopefully, of open society. So we're thinking about challenges of censorship, violent extremism, access to the internet. But what I'll talk about most here is our work in AI, which is mostly focused on the digital public square. When at the beginning of the internet, the dawn of the internet, there was so much optimism about how the internet could connect people, allow them to talk to each other, and that could foster freedom. And we saw that happen with the Arab Spring. But since then, it hasn't played out the way we hoped. We've seen actually many threats to democracy and open society and freedom coming from the digital public square, coming from online conversations. And that's the space that my team uses AI. We have a product called Perspective API, which is machine learning models to recognize harassment, toxicity, hateful content in an online conversation. And so we've been using AI in this space for many years, and we're really following along with the changes in AI. And I, at the risk of being still too optimistic here, I will provide some examples of what we're hopeful about and what we're excited about here. So our product Perspective historically has always been about identifying what's bad, what's dangerous in a conversation and removing it. With the latest large language model technology, we can actually model much more complex and nuanced ideas. And so we're now able to model what's good, what's healthy in a conversation, and connecting it back to open societies and democratic values. The cat's kind of out of the bag. The public square is online, whether we like it or not. That's happening, and if you don't have healthy conversations, you cannot have a healthy democracy. And so what does a healthy conversation mean? There's actually a lot of social science research on that we've built on, and we've identified a few different attributes of healthy contributions to a conversation that people who are reading or participating feel that make the conversation more trustworthy, they feel more comfortable to engage. So these are things like, is the person sharing a personal anecdote? Are they speaking from their own experience? Are they expressing curiosity? Do they actually want to learn from their conversation participants? And so we're able to, with the large language model technology, this is something we couldn't do before, but because those models just learn from so much data, which there's lots of risks and concern there. But one of the benefits is they have so much understanding of language that you can model things that are very rare with much less amounts of human-labeled training data. So we can actually build an effective classifier for that concept of curiosity or understanding seeking, which we could not do 2 years ago. So yeah, we're really hopeful that we can use this latest technology to not only keep conversations from becoming dangerous, but actually make them or help make them valuable and effective to do their job as the online public square.
That's great. And, recognizing we're in a law school, we do want to talk about the legal applications quickly, right? And I get questions from law students or, junior associates, is AI going to take my job? Those kinds of questions. So I wanted to talk quickly about the legal applications that we're seeing. E-discovery, this is one that's been around for a while. It's sort of like financial services and others, right? You've been using algorithms, predictive coding in order to, more quickly and efficiently review documents and produce, responsive material. Knowledge management, right? So things like Edgar, right? There are tools that can ingest everything on Edgar, the SEC filings, and then you can say, give me the last 100 filings on whatever. Now, give me the last 10 8Ks on material cyber incidents, right? So, managing knowledge and very quickly, being able to access information. drafting correspondence, right? And we're going to talk about this in a moment, but you can draft basic correspondence with your clients or others with emails. Smart contracts or smart negotiation. Increasingly, we're seeing the AI tools used as, in chatbot form or otherwise to kind of go back and forth on commercial terms in order to get to a commercial agreement. What is it not doing yet? Well, it's not drafting briefs yet. We've seen it try, and we've seen some of those attempts, and we've seen some of the attempts go badly, particularly in New York courts, right? But we still have some hallucinations on case law and other issues. So it may be helpful as a resource, but it is not yet ready to replace junior lawyers on drafting briefs. It's also not yet a decision maker. And here, I've had a lot of interesting questions and conversations about the potential for AI, particularly in alternative dispute resolution. If parties agree, we are going to submit our commercial dispute to this tool and say, you're going to describe these facts, or we're going to enter these facts, I'm going to enter these facts, and we're going to let the tool tell us, based on all of the case law, et cetera, that it's reviewed, which way this dispute should go, right? You could imagine that. You could imagine a tool that would give you a range for damages, right? So here's the contract dispute, liability has been determined, what's the range for damages? So, you can imagine parties agreeing to that. Already there are AI tools that purport to predict how a particular judge may decide a matter based on prior decisions. So really interesting potential applications in the law for like ultimate decisions, questions, damages, amounts. But in my experience, we are not there yet on those issues. So hopefully, if you are a junior lawyer coming up or a law student, these tools will enable you to be more productive and get to the best answer more quickly, but it will not yet replace you, as what we're seeing.
Actually,
yeah.
can I pick up on that
please.
point? I have an anecdote to share. So to your point about e-discovery, so typically when we represent clients in government investigations, and they'll kind of give us search terms and say, search your custodians at your company for emails, and we kind of negotiate that with the government. And we had a negotiation the other day where we said, okay, well, the search terms that you've proposed are going to yield 1 million documents, and we don't think you want to review 1 million documents. And the FTC said, well, can't you use AI to kind of cull that number to come up with a more manageable number? And so it was ironic that this agency that has kind of expressed some concerns about the use of AI in certain contexts, was saying, please use AI to help us, do our jobs. And so I think I think it goes to, and maybe this is a good segue, is it goes to like different use cases, generate different risks, right? And so I think that's the way the FTC was looking at it, is like, okay, well, if you're going to use it to help us do our jobs, great, but there's not a lot of transparency about what use cases fall in the good bucket and what use cases don't fall in the good bucket.
It's such a great anecdote, and I've heard, or I've been in discussions about the possibility of, you have like let's assume it's a 50-page limit on a brief, right? Your opening brief, so you submit it 50 pages, and then the court and the other side uses AI to summarize it, and then they have the AI draft a 50-page response brief, the other side, and then it goes to the court and you have the AI summarize it, and so you're basically, creating these long briefs that end up in these short summaries. The briefs created by AI being summarized by AI, right? So you could end up with like 10 bullet points in the middle, right? That summarize all the briefs. So like another sort of interest, is that what's going to happen, right? Where you submit something really long and the other side says, give me the main points from this brief. And then they say, write a responsive brief. Okay, and then it goes over, give me the main points from the responsive brief. So lots of interesting applications, potential applications in the law, and not entirely clear where it's going to go. So I want to talk about the cybersecurity aspects of this as well. And this is certainly an area where there is both cyber risk and cyber opportunity, right? So certainly there are lots of reports about the cyber threats that are being enabled by AI tools, and then there are cyber tools that are designed to defend networks that are leveraging the AI. I spend a lot of my time on the threat side, so I'm looking at things like how the generative AI is being used to improve and enhance phishing emails, and that includes eliminating the grammatical errors and the spelling errors, but also being able to craft a very specific phishing email to an individual targeted based on their social media. So you find somebody in LinkedIn who's somebody at the help desk who can elevate your credentials or provide credentials over the phone or an MFA token.
I'm an example of this real life.
Please, let's jump in.
So we had just had our senior management meeting, and Switch is like the top, roughly 200, it was even smaller this past year, 200 executives at MasterCard. And I had just seen our CEO, and he had seen me. And no joke, like 2 days after that meeting, I got a text, okay, saying, "Hi, Joanne, it's Michael. I'm about to go on a news show, and I need you to call me ASAP." Now, this could be legitimate request, right? But it wasn't his number that came up on my phone, and it was my work phone. It wasn't my personal phone. And I had the presence of mind, because it wasn't his normal phone, to actually call him. And on his regular phone, and he picked up right away. And I said, "Michael, I've got this text, and are you about to go on?" Because he could have. I mean, he gets interviewed, I get interviewed. And he was like, "Oh my God, no." And it was actually even more specific to an issue we had been discussing. But it was somebody who had trolled both of us and wanted our information. And it was like, "Send it to security," right? I was like, "I know what to do." That was not the problem. It was that they had so much specificity in the text to me that he was wigging out, I was wigging out, right? And it was a real, a perfect example
And it's amazing because
of that.
it's leveraging this public data, right? So I mean, if you have social media, you can look, oh, this person likes, tennis, they like
But
basketball.
I mean, if you
and then
think
it
you
comes to-
really want to call your CEO with
Yeah.
that, right? I mean, it was like, oh God, really? Like, am I being spearfished? I think I am.
Right.
But if it's really him, you really don't want to ignore him either, right?
Exactly.
That's not a career move you want to make, right?
The other variation we've seen of that is the voice deepfake, right?
Yeah,
Where there's a
very much so.
voicemail. And this is often done with companies that are global, and there's a time difference where you would get a voicemail overnight in a jurisdiction, from a jurisdiction that would make sense in the time zone, but it's not live. And when you get it in the morning, they're not in a position to be awake to call them back. And so you get a voice deepfake from a CEO or a CFO of a public company who has lots of recordings out there in connection with earnings calls and other appearances. And so there's plenty of data to train it on. It's telling you, whatever, right? We have a deal, we need to transfer this right away, et cetera. Jen, Manisha, any thoughts on the cyber
Well,
risk?
I mean, from my standpoint, as far as this, data is really king to all these conversations. And in cyber, when we're looking at AI, we're really thinking about an AI pipeline, right? So I need to protect my data or secure my data. I need to secure my model, and I need to secure my usage. And usage comes down into inference. How are the people who are going to be using whatever it is I'm developing, any of this, whatever software, whatever solution I'm developing, how are the people going to be using this? And then how do I protect against what's being injected? Where, again, we're talking about open source capabilities in software development, right? Everyone has access to this. So do the attackers. So they're injecting. Don't think that they're not injecting. There's malware. They're hijacking in certain situations. They're creating backdoors. And if I don't have a very robust governance that not just talks to, again, you had the presence of mind because this is your life. You haven't slept in how many years? I'm not sure with the different jobs that you've had the titles,
well,
right?
Exactly, and I've been trained, and so is our
You are.
CEO, and we'll talk about what we do with our board too.
Sure.
Right? But yeah, everybody's been trained up and down.
But I have data scientists.
Yeah,
Data
exactly.
scientists who or I have software developers that are just eager and excited. I want to get this out. I have the pressure from my boss. I've got to reduce headcount. And yes, it does happen where headcount's reduced, but it ideally is in the betterment of how do I retrain and how do I upskill other individuals. But I've got the pressure to get something done. And again, back to the risk and the reward. If I'm not protecting my data, if I don't have a robust policy in terms of identity and access, and we know that not everybody has a robust, we've seen it in recent news. If I don't necessarily have a strong data discovery and classification model, and if I don't have this is our security posture for all of us, then no, I don't necessarily feel super comfortable that I've got my data under control. Now, in terms of the model in and of itself, as I just mentioned, there are ways that backdoors are entered. There are ways that we inject certain malware. How am I making that, if I'm developing an app and I'm using an API, how am I scanning regularly and hardening that API? And am I doing that? This is table stakes. If you're going to be using open source code, and you have any level of ICAP or any level of crown jewels material that you are training this model with, it's open season. And again, that's a risk reward. How do you choose to, what are you choosing to develop with? How are you choosing to govern that? And then back to the, in terms of usage, in terms of live use, in terms of the lineage, in terms of prominence, am I experiencing any levels of drift? So is the model working the way it's expected to work? And how is the use taking place?
And back to the tech debt that Lenny was mentioning, right?
Yes.
If you have any kind of tech debt on your provenance of your data, on your APIs, on your calls, this is the area that you need to be kind of making, your investments in, because, we talk a lot about that, right? Your weaknesses is going to be your employees. How well are they trained? But then also, because the world is becoming increasingly connected, this is where the vulnerabilities are going to lie. And how close are your crown jewels to those API calls? They should not be very close, right? I mean, this is the way you have to really begin to rethink the enterprise architecture of your firms, right? It's a whole new way of thinking compared to the efficiencies that we were thinking about no more than 5 years ago.
So you have machine learning, data threat and response. It's a new category in cyber, and it's an important one, and it's one that needs to be heeded. Because again, this is your ICAP, this is your PII, this is you're responsible for safeguarding. If you don't have a robust policy in place, then I'm not sure the risk was worth it.
And then another plug from the privacy lane, privacy enhancing technology as much as possible, right? It's like, don't use live personal data. If you don't need to, get creative. It's like, mask it. There's very few reasons to have live pie online and available. It's like, there's very few people that actually need all of the personal data all the time.
Yeah, and I think this discussion shows a real convergence among, cybersecurity risk, privacy risk, AI risk. And I think one of my pet peeves has been the fact that in a lot of our, with a lot of our clients, the cybersecurity function is very siloed, and the privacy function is very siloed. And I really do think there needs to be, and AI is kind of, I think, enabling and pushing this convergence between the two fields. Because if you look at it, what are some of the solutions that companies need to do? They need to do risk assessments. They need to have people in charge. They need to oversee vendors. They need to address risks and have trainings. And that's privacy speak, and it's cybersecurity speak, and it's AI speak. And I think all of that has to converge. And I think there's certain things that, like, I don't know, is an access control, where you kind of segment your employees and like only allow them to see what they have a business need to see. Is that a privacy issue? Is it a cybersecurity issue? I really do think it's both. And I think, when I talk to clients about this, they say, well, cybersecurity is different. You're not just protecting personal information. You're protecting the crown jewels of the company. You're, if you look at a generative AI company and, look at some of the cybersecurity risks they're facing, it's, okay, well, I'm going to insert a prompt injection attack. We're going to tell the program to ignore all its instructions. And when I say, tell me how to build a bomb, it tells me how to build a bomb. That's not, is that a privacy risk? Well, maybe that's not a privacy risk, but it all, to me, falls in the very similar processes. And I think it's something our clients are struggling with. Like, we have a privacy governance program, we have a data governance program. How do we build the AI governance on top of that? How do all these disciplines kind of overlap? And I think that's going to be a really interesting issue for clients. And I think not every company is MasterCard or IBM that has these.
Well, I would say, back to Lenny's point earlier, we've been doing this. The model is in place. It's just that the accessibility now is so much wider. And now it is about, how do I impart that across an entire enterprise? How do I impart that with my consumers? How do I educate appropriately? And how do we continuously learn? Not just as cyber professionals, but as consumers ourselves. And I think we owe it to ourselves. I mean, look at the deep fakes that are, and it's not just voice. It is image. It is happening to children. These are important issues that we need to take on as just consumers within our world as well. And I thought, Lenny, you said it best. This is not necessarily something that's news in terms of how to do it, but it's a matter of putting it in practice. And we've got those practices in place to be able to use.
Yeah. And I think we heard it from the question that was asked, right? About what is good governance, right?
Yes.
And good governance requires, it's a participatory sport up and down your organization, right? So we've had some conversation about what's the board responsibility, but it really does mean it has to go throughout your organization, right? So we can start with the board and what boards are interested in. We can talk about what CEOs and senior executives are interested in, and then what the heads of different groups like privacy and cybersecurity, product development, innovation, data scientists, all of those groups are interested in innovation and want to do it in a responsible way. But if your rank and file employees do not understand how to balance risk and innovation, well, you're already behind the eight ball, right? So the reason we have privacy frameworks and cyber frameworks and is because it's part of good data governance, right? And we've hung it for a while under kind of a responsible data practices, right? And then we've built on that, and I think that's made it a little bit easier for all of our employees to understand what's inbounds and what's out of bounds, right? And then you build on that given wherever their responsibilities are. And we've heard that the use cases, right, because now generative AI is in HR, it's in legal, it's in marketing, it's in customer service. Every single employee is going to have to make some of these trade-offs. It's like, wait a minute, if I'm going to use this chatbot, if I'm going to actually engage differently, what are those risks? What do I need to know? And so there's a sea change happening. That is what's different about this moment in time, is that everybody kind of has to retrain and everybody has to get re-engaged. And and it kind of is fun.
It is.
Right?
It
Lucy's
is.
right. It's like, it's an amazing time to be in any kind of organization, whether it's in education, whether it's in business, whether it's in a law firm. It really is very exciting, but you've got to participate. And, Lenny said it really well. I think I wrote it down in my little notebook, Lenny. It's like, you've got to really be part of that change. So you got to train yourself up. You got to hang out with the people who know what they're talking about. But it really is different this time in that the trade-offs are not just privacy trade-offs if it's personal data. It's not just cyber trade-offs. It's all of these trade-offs.
It is.
It's participatory
We have an Institute of Business Value, and I'll publish this. Lincoln, I'd love to be able to chat with you longer. About 93 to 94% of business leaders feel that absolutely, no question, I need AI somewhere in my business. 96% feel as if in the next 3 years I will be attacked because of what I do with AI. So there's an absolute balance, and this is a great inflection point. I would never be able to read all those briefs, and I am not legally trained. But boy, I can now start to become more proficient and exposed to how should I make different decisions with better knowledge. However, I do want to make sure that lineage has been handled appropriately.
Well, and I think just to share a couple of examples of this kind of, convergence and I think Joanna said that, we need this cross-disciplinary effort, and we need kind of cybersecurity and privacy and AI experts talking to each other. So we've been talking about deep fakes. And there's a lot of risks that would suggest that content moderation might be the answer, right? So like you have humans review things before they go out to make sure there's, not hate speech or disinformation or anything like that. But, does that come at a cost to privacy? So are you like reading people's, private information, their private searches to kind of glean that information and make sure that that doesn't happen? So there's a societal benefit to looking at people's private information. And so how do you balance that within an organization? And then the other example is, one of the concerns is about, whether it's credit decision-making or employment decision-making, and making sure that AI doesn't lead to biased results.
Yes.
And I think one solution potentially is to do demographic testing. So does this model perform well with different demographics? Well, if I'm of a certain race or gender, I might not want to share that information. Right. And so how do you balance that privacy need with kind of the broader societal good? So I think there's a lot of interesting questions that companies are grappling with around these competing societal goods. And I think that's why this is such an interesting time and area for us all to be practicing.
So 2 points, and I'm going to come right back to Lucy because I know you have some interesting thoughts on this. But on the cyber side as well, it's a great point about this sort of cross-pollination, because with respect to cyber defense, what you see now are tools that are getting better at detecting anomalies on your network. right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
right, like suspicious logins
Yes.
is right. That's
Right.
right. Is it the right time zone? Right?
Yes.
Is it the right? Is the IP address pinging at the right
That's right.
location?
Mhm.
And if not, this used to be like up to somebody looking at the logs
Exactly.
or some alerting
Right.
function, and the
Now it's
tools are
real
getting
time.
very good at this,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
In part because they can lean into what's been done on the financial services side
Exactly.
and detect fraud and things like that. So it's very interesting to see the defense is getting better at the same time that the attackers are getting better, and then we're in the,
We're in the arms
we're
race
in the arms
forever.
race.
Yes.
We're in the cybersecurity arms race. But the defense capabilities are improving with the tools as well. So the attackers are getting better, but the defenses are getting better as well. I want to pick up on the point we're making.
Can I
Oh, yeah,
jump in on that
please jump
topic
in.
before
Please
you
jump in.
go
Yeah.
onto the new ones?
Yeah.
The idea of the intersection between security and privacy and the kind of arms race, and we've got new challenges and then therefore new mitigations. One of the ones that I am most concerned about is with generative AI, AI can now be part of our online conversations and manipulate online conversations, manipulate public opinion. And so that's a huge concern, big risk.
Yes.
And many companies, many places are starting to think about, well, how do I protect against that?
Yes.
And you've all seen CAPTCHAs, you've all seen those types of things, right? The general idea is, okay, we want to protect our spaces to make sure that the people who are participating really are people and not robots, which is exciting, and that's what we should be doing, but there's a huge risk there of going too far. Governments, authoritarian governments around the world are starting to produce technology to identify each individual. And I can envision a dystopia where you can't participate online without, having your government ID to log in anywhere. And so as we start thinking about how do we protect these spaces and identify who's a person and who's not a person, we now have a whole new set of privacy concerns. How do we do that while still allowing the right level of privacy for that particular use case?
It's a great point. And it gets to where I want to go next, which is in connection with some of these broader sort of societal issues that Manisha has brought up in connection with these tools. Some of you may have seen, there was recently an article in the Wall Street Journal about AI tools, and it said, something to the effect of using a large language model to draft an email is like getting a Lamborghini to deliver a pizza, right? The capability that you're tapping into for that task, the data that's been collected to train that model, and the potential energy in terms of the calculations required on the back end, right? Is there really we're talking about the trade-off? Is is the benefit really worth everything else that's happening in the background, right? For how we're using these tools.
Sure.
Something can be extremely powerful, and yet you can use them for rather mundane things, right?
Exactly.
You make a dinner reservation, find me a flight,
Mm-hmm.
here at 9 a.m. Lucy, I want to get your thoughts on complications like that. Sort of
Yeah.
some of the complicating factors about sort of this latest iteration of the tools and the AI tools that we're seeing.
So with respect to the energy usage and just how massive these models are, it's a huge challenge. And that's been true for AI for many years, just growing and growing. I think we are now getting, and unfortunately, it hasn't been that well addressed in the tech industry. It just isn't, there aren't a lot of tools to measure, how much energy am I using? Or we're not optimizing for reducing that energy. But going back to what Linny was talking about, connecting to the business needs, the models are getting so big that it's expensive to run them. So there is the energy concerns, but there's also just a raw cost. And it's now becoming valuable within a business to don't overuse it. So I think this is an area that requires a lot more work, but the incentives are starting to align better. So I foresee we'll be thinking about this a bunch more in the future. But then on the flip side, part of the benefit of these really huge models is that for each individual task you might use them for, you actually don't need to do as much. So instead of, for example, I'll give a specific example of another aspect that my team is working on. So as I said, we are building tools for moderators and online platforms to help identify what you might want to take down, as well as what represents a good conversation. And until now, that was one model for all of our users. Because building that model is intensive and it's hard to serve, and it's a large task. With the foundation models that we have today, we're now on the cusp of being able to really customize. And so you do that huge training process one time, but you could actually build maybe a separate customized model for every single community that we're working with. So each individual community having a conversation could really tailor moderation and what to uplift for their needs. You can imagine a conversation, for example, among sexual assault survivors where victim blaming is just not acceptable, right? That's not a moderation standard that's typical in a lot of online communities, and there's not resources to support that. Now we could build that. And in fact, that's because of these huge models, right? You've got your fabulous Lamborghini and you just like add a little bit on top of it, and now it can do many different things. And even though you used a ton of energy resources to build that one foundation, you can actually do each individual task with much less resources on top of it.
So moving toward a more specialized use of the models.
Exactly. Yeah, with a little bit of a layer on top of that really large foundation.
Yeah, great.
And we are seeing more companies that are requiring, or at least being regulated in some situations with respect to sustainability. So we're about to open up a new cyber range in Washington, D.C. And as you can imagine, in a SOC, I'm not sure how many of you have had the ability to be able to be in one, there's quite a bit of production that's taking place in that facility. Not just within the room, but also generating from AI-driven solutions. So yes, the power that takes place in these organizations and in these rooms, it is massive. In DC, we do have to regulate that, and so we do have to show what is the usage. We have to show what's happening within the room. We have to be able to show from a power standpoint, and we need to be able to have it on a wall that anyone can see, and then you can make decisions. Better or worse, sometimes it's too much information. I'm not sure that everyone needs all this information, but at the same time, you can see, is IBM within these guidelines? Does this range fall within the parameters of what's expected in DC? And how are you regulating it if you're not? So we're seeing a large movement, especially as we are proliferating more energy use through some of these models. And how are we being held accountable for it? And there are solutions for it. So, and again, some cities and governments are taking it a little bit faster than others, but it does seem to be going across the states.
Really interesting example of interconnected risk here too, right? So if we become reliant on these models and there is some energy use that's associated with that, then you loop in the cyber risk on the critical infrastructure side to our energy infrastructure, right? If somebody suddenly is attacking our energy infrastructure, it's not just the fuel, it's now also the energy that's required to use these models, right? And how are we using them? So, bringing the cybersecurity angle back into it, something that you wouldn't naturally maybe initially connect cyber risk to the energy sector or the energy grid.
This room would.
It will now. But cybersecurity risk to the energy grid, it doesn't just implicate sort of the engines of our economy or literally the cars, but also now the use of these tools.
All the OT, the use cases with it's an imperative, frankly, and it's something that we should also demand as not only citizens of the states, but when we're voting, this should be something we're thinking about when we go out to vote.
Well, also I think the connection to critical infrastructure. So I think what's interesting is that the Biden administration put out this executive order on AI, and the authority they used, basically the executive order says that certain government departments have to set standards for red teaming, and that certain large language model companies have to report to the government on the risks associated with their system. And the authority they used for that was authority under the Defense Production Act, which is typically used in national emergencies. It was used during COVID, during the pandemic. It's used in wars, and they said this is a national emergency because of some of the implications, the national security implications of these big generative AI tools. And so I think that was like the way the executive branch got its nose under the camel's tent to put out this AI executive order. So we talk about privacy, security, there's also cybersecurity, but there's also national security implications.
Okay, so for those of you online, this is the most important thing I'm going to say during the session. It's the CLE code. So this is really the only thing you have to pay attention to right now. The code is CCS 5739. So that's Charlie Charlie Sierra 5739 CCS 5739. So hopefully everybody got that. So I want to shift gears and I want to actually return to a topic that we started discussing, but I want to dive into a little bit more, and it's governance, because this is a hot topic. We are hearing a lot about AI governance from regulators. The NIST AI Risk Management Framework talks about it elsewhere. Would love the panel's thoughts. What is AI governance? What does it mean? And what does good governance look like for artificial intelligence? So Joanne, I'm going to start with you, but I'd like to hear from the other panelists.
Yeah, this is a meaty topic, right? We could probably do a panel just on governance and be here for quite a while. So I will try to let everybody chime in on this one because I suspect we all have ideas. So, governance, I think we talked a little bit previously about how there's been data governance, there's been privacy governance, there's been cyber governance. And I think what we're seeing with AI governance is that AI governance is building on all of those disciplines. And I think it does depend a little bit as to the organization that we're talking about and how they're using data and how they're using AI. But most organizations that are building AI do need an AI governance methodology. And what we're seeing is that many organizations, at least in the financial sector in particular, start out with principles, right? Which are a very good place to start. Why? Well, it at least tells your organization what's important and what will be checked. But they cannot stay at that principle level. Principles are not enough in this area. And we started out in privacy and in cyber, we had cyber principles, we had privacy principles, right? And so it's a good place to start because it also allows you to line up those other types of discipline behind your AI. But what we're finding is that it's actually important to then come up with a practical way of doing that use case assessment that we started with, right? Depending upon how an organization is actually using AI, it needs an interdisciplinary review of that artificial intelligence use case. When we started talking about use cases, you can have use cases that we would call kind of efficiency use cases that are inside an organization, improving how HR is functioning, how we're processing in new candidates, promotions, etc. But those type of use cases will have issues of bias. They will have use cases, issues of privacy. They will have issues of how you're protecting the data. But they will also allow an organization to begin to get their feet wet on what are the risks that need to be assessed, as well as kind of what's the data science behind it, what's the enterprise architecture, the technology, as well as the safety and security of that information. And so your practice needs to focus first on what data is being used, what's the risk associated with that data, what are the different disciplines that need to be involved, how are the models being created? Manisha talked about bias. You need to look at the model for drift. You need to be able to come up with a bunch of different types of testing of that model. And then the last mile is really looking at the output of that model and did it really achieve what you designed that model for? What was the outcome of that model? And then do the refining through that process, making sure all the different disciplines have had a chance to actually review it. Now, it sounds really simple when you put it on a nice wheel. Everybody gets really excited. Doing this is really hard. And most organizations are refining their processes because the first use cases of efficiency are the easier ones to do. Then you're going to start doing ones that refine your products and add in generative AI. You're using, kind of predictive AI. And then there are those greenfield ideas of something brand new to your firm. You need a different perspective for things that are easy, that have low risk, and the risks you need to quantify. So things that we would say are green versus yellow versus, in my firm, we use orange and red, and then we use purple, and where the sign-offs are and where the risks versus rewards are on the innovation and risk scale. And every discipline gets to weigh those so that you actually know where the issues are. And eventually, it's a bit of a flywheel effect that Lucy kind of mentioned, that things get easier as you do more, right? But it also enables different disciplines to get better at assessing the privacy risk, assessing the cyber risk, assessing the architecture, assessing tech debt, et cetera. So that is kind of governance writ large. It generally has to also align to all of the new regulation and frameworks that are out there. So here's the other challenge. This is a moving target. We have the EU Act, we have the executive order, we have the emerging NIST standards that are kind of aligning with the executive order. We have work coming out of the UK if you're a global firm. And also if you're a regulated entity in healthcare, financial services, you also have all of those risks that you have to still navigate depending upon your sector. So jump in, ladies.
I think that you covered that quite well.
The field is yours.
It's the guardrails, right?
Yeah.
So it's establishing what are those guardrails? How am I protecting the lineage? What is the lineage? Sometimes it's asking just the basic questions of what, who, and why, and repeatedly doing this. Because the cool thing is AI is also being injected into governance. So all the more important to understand what does this mean and why is this there? Because again, drift it's real. It's whether it's something that's happening by someone who's an attacker, or whether it's just happening because maybe the model isn't working the way that you had expected, and that's based on live use again, and who has access and why
and
they're
what
accessing.
data did you start with? Was that
Exactly.
data complete? We haven't talked about the quality of the data that you have.
Mhm.
We really kind of, the issue of bias has to go with, do you have a complete data set for the outcome you're trying to drive toward, right?
And I think the financials, you're in a space that you've been dealing with this. I would say almost a decade. I mean, this is not new.
Yeah, but even so, we know we have flat spots,
Mhm.
right? And how are we filling those in?
Mhm.
How are we making sure that those outcomes are correct? It really is, there's a science to this, and then really making sure that we understand the impact, not just for individuals, but also for communities, right?
Yes.
And groups. I mean, I work with the World Economic Forum on this whole topic of data equity,
Mhm.
and there really are flat sides in this world. The difference with artificial intelligence is that artificial intelligence is telling us what the data says, but we never collected the data for all the purposes for which we're using it. So there are real flat sides and missing information that therefore is missing in the outcomes that we're getting.
Yes.
And we really need to be mindful of that.
And I think it goes back to your earlier topic of the internet was created for a purpose.
Yeah.
And this is also here for a purpose. How we handle and manage it. Frankly, this is the next generation just as much as the people here are on this table, in this panel. What are we going to be doing for the next 35 years? How are you going to make some of these decisions as you go forward? It's an important part of your education and an important part for the rest of us as well.
One of the challenges with where we are now is exactly as you said, the use case analysis, what's the goal here? How do we evaluate for bias, for risk, for challenges with that use case? Now, with foundation models, you're building one model that can be used for so many different things
Exactly.
with just a little bit of tweaking.
Why?
And
Exactly.
so and as I said, I'm really excited about that. There's a lot we can do with it, but it also adds the challenge of how do I protect that model? What are the guardrails on that when I don't know the precise use case?
Right.
It's a huge new challenge, and we've only just figured
Exactly.
out how to do
Exactly.
Right.
the use case analysis and put some guardrails on a model that we know the purpose for. So again, I'm excited for figuring out that
Absolutely.
challenge. That's what my team is working on today.
Yes.
But it's a big unknown world, and the way you might protect that foundation model, the right types of guardrails or mitigations for bias or for any privacy risk or anything, they're going to be different depending on different use cases.
That's right.
And we really need to think through. There's not a one size fits all answer, and that's a big challenge when you're building models for fitting a lot of use cases.
And I'm going to come back to Manisha, but I want to talk about the training data again for a minute, because we talked about missing data or the possibility of data not being representative, right?
Right.
Not having certain groups opting out of use of a tool,
Exactly.
and so their data is not reflected,
Right.
right? But there's another issue on the other side, on the cyber risk side of things, of the injection of data,
Exactly.
right?
That's
So
right.
bad actors poisoning data sets by
Hijacking
injecting,
data sets,
injecting
exactly. Yep.
large amounts of,
Yep.
knowing that something's trained on public information, injecting large amounts of information to cause the model to learn one way or another.
Cloning the model, making
Cloning
it
the
look like
model.
it's your model. It's not really your model, but you have users who are using that model that looks like your model. Absolutely.
And so, how are you protecting the training data, right? Not just
Well,
how are you
and then
evaluating it,
If
but
you're
how are you
publishing
protecting
the
it?
model, not putting the model in a container, right? We have examples of, I don't know, the car dealerships in Detroit, that they didn't put the model in a container so it can be used for anything. And so people, it's they haven't even realized the cost of that these poor dealerships are incurring. And so they are also referring, that it's supposed to be to, figure out what model of car would be good for you. And it's referring you to, like, if it's a Chevy dealership, it's saying a Ford. And then it's also allowing you to ask any question under the sun of the model, right?
Sure.
I know. So there's all sorts of risks that we have to really guard against, for sure.
Yeah.
We can go back to the energy, denial of service,
Yep.
just continuous attacks. How much more am I paying to my cloud provider
Mhm.
for whatever it is that I'm doing?
Exactly.
I mean, there's a lot of different points of inflection from an attacker standpoint.
I mean, and I think to the one-size-fits-all point, I mean, we have clients who do this AI governance or are starting to do the AI governance, and they're hiring, EY and PwC and all these outside consultants that build these beautiful charts and spreadsheets, and they said, okay, there's the EU AI Act, there's NIST
Yes.
framework, there's executive order, and you kind of map everything and you kind of have controls in place to make sure that you're complying with everything. So that's kind of the large company side. But I'm struck by, a lot of our clients are startups, and I'm struck by how much of this is just like a conversation and a lot of common sense, conversation. It's like, what are your use cases? What do you foresee as the risks? And it's really just tailoring and building a governance program around that conversation. Now, it's helpful to have the experts there to say, well, here's a risk, is like, have you thought about poisoning your data set? And, if you're a voice cloning company, what are the risks there? We talked about, the risks of, things like grandparent scams, using somebody's voice for grandparent scam. But there's also these wonderful use cases about ALS victims who are preserving their voice so their loved ones can hear. So again, just talking through it and really build, and what I think companies shouldn't do is like work off of a template. Like, it's always good to have templates, but everything I think has to be very bespoke and tailored to your particular risks and use cases. And are you a vendor? Are you a builder of AI technology, or a user of AI technology? Where you sit in the marketplace.
Nisha, I'm going to come right back to you because this is going to run us headlong into regulators. So I would love your take on AI and the regulators. Based on your experience, what are they interested in? How should companies be thinking about this? What are the interagency dynamics like? What are your thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts. I think if I had to boil it down, I think there's probably, in the cybersecurity and privacy adjacent areas, I think there's 5 main things that regulators are concerned about. The first is we've heard the term AI washing, and it's basically exaggerating the actual AI nature of your service in some cases, and it's also exaggerating what your AI can do. So there's a lot of companies making claims out there that we can use AI to help you do X, Y, Z, and it's really just kind of old tactics, like not really AI. We've seen companies that say, our product can help you be 100% bias-free. So that's kind of an example of something that I think the regulators are taking a look at.
Identification for that.
Yeah, so that's number 1. Number 2 is privacy, both of the training data. So I think there's some regulator concerns about scraping the internet for the public training data. Also, how prompts are used. So prompts are used to train the model, to enrich the model. What is the danger that your query to an AI system could be revealed in somebody else's use of that system? So I think that's a second major concern. I think the third concern is cybersecurity. What are companies doing to protect against prompt injection attacks? A lot of, the AI executive order kind of expresses that concern. A fourth area is copyright, and it's interesting because, like, as a former FTC person, like, I never thought that was within the FTC's area of expertise, but they did this whole workshop involving creators who were saying that, and it was very skewed towards creators who were saying that AI was being used in ways that they weren't getting compensated for their works, and that and so I think regulators are very concerned about that. And then the last thing I would mention is competition. So just yesterday, the FTC put out a study, a 6B study, which is kind of an industry study of partnerships in the AI area. So it was Microsoft and OpenAI and Anthropic and Google and some of the other companies. And they hosted a forum where it was very interesting. The chair said, she talked about her view that competition law had failed us throughout the 90s and 2000s. And to the extent that we saw so much consolidation, and now she wants to avoid that same thing in the AI space. So it was a very interesting analogy she used. She said that, you know, we let Boeing get too big, we approved the Boeing McDonnell Douglas merger, and now planes are coming out of the sky. So so it was a very kind of provocative, you know, framing. And there were 3 panels. There was 1 on kind of the chips and cloud, 2 on the data and models, and 3 on consumer applications. So competition and consumer protection concerns weaved throughout. And the basic thesis seemed to be that all of these big companies have the computing power, there's not a lot of competition in the AI space, and what products consumers use is a function of who has the most money, most infrastructure, most capital. And it should be the AI systems that consumers use are going to be the ones that are the best. So very interesting public statements coming out of the FTC on those issues. So huge range.
Yeah. Joanne, I'd love your thoughts. You've been in a highly regulated industry, financial services for some time. What are your thoughts about this
Sorry,
AI?
my brain is like reeling at what Manisha just was saying. Sorry. So there was a chart actually talking about market caps of firms and driving the stock market. And every firm and issue that Manisha just highlighted showed that the correlation. And so it's kind of just supporting the FTC's point. So just that was, so I'm sorry, I was just like listening like everybody else going, wow. But I guess, you know, my brain, because we're a global company, also goes globally, right? So that's everything Manisha said times 2, but then, you know, as a global organization, you have to look at everything that's going on internationally, right? So right now the EU Act is, oh my God, inching its way across the finish line. It's painful, but it will get done, that's for sure. It will have, it's a risk-based approach is what they will tell you, and it is, except that the risks are going to be really painfully defined by all of us. And so I think that's going to be an interesting moment for all sorts of companies, because it's anyone who does business in the EU. You don't have to be based in the EU, similar to the GDPR. So I think the EU Act, certainly. I think we have to look out for all of the advisory groups, right? So the United Nations has a advisory group that they've loosely put together, and we don't know what that's going to mean yet, but we will this year. So this year will be, I have a chart literally on my lap because I'm the digital policy chair for the USCIB, which is kind of the US version of the Chamber of Commerce internationally. The OECD is redoing its governance principles. The G7, the Hiroshima AI process, we're going to be looking at. UNESCO is going to have a summit with AI ethics recommendations coming back out. And then obviously NIST, and then the UK Safety Summit as well. So, and then the Council of Europe is going to come out with something. So, and then APEC is this year too, and so stand by. It's just a lot. It's a lot for legal professionals and policy professionals to keep track of. And so, yes, there will be lots of consulting firms that will do great charts for everybody. But having lived both on the legal side of the world and then the practical side of the world, you're going to have to harmonize this for what the firm you work for does or the firm you're counseling does. I couldn't say that better because it's in context of what are you producing and where are you a platform firm, right? So are you a foundation model firm? I think that means one thing. If you're consuming those models, and then where, in what context, is it financial services? Certainly pharmaceutical companies, you know, we all sit here with the benefit of all the COVID vaccines. Those were all based on AI. I think that we're going to see a sea change of practices this year as firms get more and more comfortable in this new world order. But certainly by the end of this year, we will have, I think, better ideas of what must be included in a framework. and what will be specific to different industries. So, but globally, there's a lot going on.
Other thoughts from the panel on international implications or how to think about that?
I mean, the only thing I'd say is that, we talk about the arms race, the bad actors versus the good cases. And then I think there's an arms race in regulation too. And I think the US is behind. And they're looking at the EU AI Act and they're like, oh my gosh, what should we do now? So I think that's why you're seeing all these statements from the FTC. You have state attorneys general, you have state privacy laws, a lot of AI activity at the state level and executive order too. So I think everybody's scrambling to fill in the vacuum.
I always think, though, the EU does a great job in leading. I mean, we saw that with GDPR. They've helped us be able to build from those models, and I think that's been very helpful for us. I also see countries that are developing their own models for only exclusive use within that country. So Taiwan, they're working so that they can
Taiwan,
separate
Korea.
from themselves with China. How do I build this so that I can use this in hospitals, I can use this within my government, I can use this within different business structures. Those we'll start to see maybe less globalization and more localization as some of this also starts to draw itself out.
Yeah, Singapore.
Yeah.
Yeah, UK.
Authoritarian governments are working faster than
Yes.
democratic
Yes,
governments
for sure.
to build technology that aligns with their values and what they believe should be happening in their country. And they're not only doing that for their own countries, they are selling that. They're
Yes,
giving
that's
that
true.
to other
That's true.
countries, and it's proliferating around the world. So I think that's definitely a huge risk that we're thinking about. And in open societies, we should be thinking about what does it mean to embed those values of freedom and human rights in our technology as well, because authoritarians are thinking about the opposite.
And they're government sponsored, right? So they're
Exactly.
funded completely differently than how our worlds are funded.
And their
I think
guardrails are a little
they're
different.
different.
Very
Yeah.
different
That's
guidelines.
right.
Yes.
That's a really good point, Lisa.
It's I think from an international law standpoint, this is a really good panel, or another good panel for you to think about for the future.
We have our next panelist.
That's
Judy
right.
over there. So I think we are at time. I want to thank all of our panelists on the stage and Linny, who was our unofficial fifth panelist, for her amazing remarks that we built upon.
Yes,
So
we
thank
did.
you
Thank you.
for your comments before and where that launched our conversation today. And I want to thank all of these wonderful women up here who did just a fabulous job of talking about these issues today. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.